So today is the first of 3 weeks on ethical literacy, and we're beginning the weeks of both a combination of a public presentation and lecture from Savannah this week, and then Danielle Villasana next week, and concluding with Shaminda Dulai on the 17th of October. And we're combining those as public events, as we normally run our events, with a workshop for selected photographers. We have 17 photographers that we invited to the workshop. So a slightly different format. So the public part of this, which everyone is here for now, will go, Savannah's going to make a presentation for about 30 minutes, and we'll have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A, for which please put the questions in the Q&A box, and I'll bring those in at the end and ask those. So it will be a little bit shorter than normal webinars, but then we will switch to the workshop with the photographers who have a different link for that. So Savannah's going to kick off with an introduction to the question of photography ethics. What is it and why doesn't it matter, to get us set up? So Savannah, over to you.
That's great. Thanks so much, David, for setting that up there. I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Hopefully you can see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today we're starting off with quite a broad question, right? What are photography ethics, and why does photography ethics matter, right? Or why does ethics matter in photography? As David said, my name is Savannah Dodd. I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. My background is in anthropology, and I'm also a practicing photographer. Through the Photography Ethics Center, we offer a wide range of multimedia educational content. So that's things like articles, videos, the Photo Ethics podcast. We also run online courses. We do workshops like the one we're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks with VII. And we also run campaigns. I'm going to tell you about one of our campaigns at the end of this brief lecture or introductory lecture today. And you'll have an opportunity to sort of participate in that if you so wish. So today we're really getting started with this 3-week program, right? By talking about what are ethics, right? What are photography ethics? And I think a lot of times in photography, what we see is that ethics are often described as codes or as guidelines. Ethical debates are very frequently reduced to descriptions of maybe behavior that's ethical or behavior that's unethical. I don't really think that this language is serving us. I think it's a very limiting approach to sort of this question of what ethics actually are. I think that this idea of ethics as codes and guidelines can kind of perpetuate an illusion that there are these immovable rules. And if we stick to these rules, we can navigate every situation with ethical certainty, right? But reality is a lot messier than that. I'm sure we all know, we all have experience of situations where it just doesn't pan out that way. The way that it looks on paper doesn't really pan out in reality when it's put into practice. It's also messier because ethics are changing and evolving. They're not static things, right? The world is changing, technologies are changing. We're seeing this with AI. So I think, that sort of immovable idea of rules is limiting us, I think, in photography. I think that this language as well, and this approach of ethics as guidelines or codes, suggests that it's possible for photographers to be 100% ethical and faultless. And again, reality is messier, right? The reality is that we're always making ethical decisions, and we're always making different judgment calls. And a lot of times when we're making those decisions, there's actually more than one possible right answer to all of these, or a lot of these decisions that we're making, right? So that idea of sort of ethical certainty, I think, is something that we're trying to grasp for, but I think it's tricking us a little bit, and I think it's limiting us. So instead of approaching photography ethics as guidelines or as a binary between ethical and unethical, I prefer a slightly different definition of ethics. I like to approach ethics as the principles that guide a person's behavior. And there are a lot of reasons why I like this definition. But one of the things that I really appreciate about this definition is that I think it really helps to account for maybe like 3 key characteristics of ethics. The first characteristic is that ethics are subjective, right? So how I make ethical decisions is shaped by sort of the value system that I was raised in, the life experiences that I've had, my identity and my positionality in society. So all of these things are going to shape how I make ethical decisions. So it's very personal, right? And just because I make a certain ethical decision and David, for example, makes a different ethical decision, one of us isn't necessarily right or wrong, right? We're coming at it from our own perspective, from our own positionality, and from our own, life experience and moral framework. The second characteristic is that ethics are contextual. So this is really just saying that the contexts that we're working in are going to inform how we make ethical decisions. And there are really 3 different types of context, primarily. I mean, there are lots of different ways we can think about context, but there are 3 types of context that I think are really worth drawing our attention to today. The first type of context is sort of the geographic and the cultural context of where a photograph is taken and where it's going, wherever it's going to be seen. Now, it's really important to say that when we're talking about the geographic and cultural context, we're not talking about double standards, right? We're not saying that, what we do as photographers, what I do as a photographer in Belfast, where I live, is going to be different than if I'm visiting a lower middle income country, right? That is not what we're talking about when we're talking about geographic context and sort of considering the geographic context. Instead, what we're talking about is having a genuine engagement and understanding of the sociocultural, political, environmental, and historical contexts where a photograph is going. So that's really just trying to be aware, what's happening in this place where I'm taking photographs, and how is that going to influence either the way that I'm taking photographs or the kinds of photographs that I'm taking or the way I'm presenting photographs. So that's sort of the first type of context, one of 3, right? The second type of context that I want to touch on is the sort of the genre, right? So there are lots of different genres of photography, as we all know, right? But there are going to be sort of different considerations, different ethical considerations if we're presenting work as photojournalism than if we're presenting work as fine art and it's going to hang on the walls of a gallery, right? So when we're making work, when we're making ethical decisions, we're thinking about where is this going to be seen? How is it going to be seen? How is it going to be interpreted by the audience? And what genre am I presenting it in? So that's that second type of context. The third type of context is the sort of the institutions that we're working within. So this is maybe where we can start to talk about those codes and guidelines, right? So different institutions are going to have different ethical codes or ethical guidelines that maybe it's an employer, and those are sort of codes and guidelines that you need to abide by when you're working for that employer or that client. Or maybe it's a competition that you're wanting to submit a photograph to. So, for example, the Environmental Photographer of the Year Award has their own code of ethics. And when you're submitting photographs to them, you need to be, conscious and taking on board their ethical codes and guidelines into when you're making the work and when you're making ethical decisions about the work. So, that's the other type of context there. It's those client guidelines, the institutional guidelines that we're working within. So bringing all that together, that gives us the third characteristic of ethics, which is that ethics are fluid. So the point behind this is really that ethics are going to be applied a little bit differently by different people in different situations, working on different projects, right? So if I'm working one day for a a local paper, a local newspaper, I'm going to have a different sort of approach to that way that I'm making ethical decisions than if I'm doing a personal project that's going to hang in a gallery, right? So I need to have that adaptability to be able to negotiate between the different contexts, the different genre requirements, the different projects that I'm working on. I think that this idea of fluidity can also be really useful for us as individuals, because I think that if we're thinking about ethics as something that, is adaptable, that we need to negotiate constantly, it's not sort of a rote list of rules that we can just abide by, but actually it's something that needs to be constantly negotiated. I think that allows us space to grow as well. So as I learn new things, as I have new life experiences, the way that I approach ethics in my photography work changes, right? The world is changing. We're changing. Like it's really inevitable. But I think that a lot of times we have a lot of shame about sort of the past decisions that we've made as photographers. The things, maybe there are photographs that I took 10 years ago that I wouldn't take today. And I think that we should view that as a positive thing, not as a shameful thing, but as a sign that, we're learning and we're growing and we're developing our ethical understanding as photographers and as people. So I think that those, if we look back at what we were talking about with those ideas of the codes and guidelines, I think those can perpetuate that unattainable idea of ethical perfection. And I think that can make it very hard for us to be vulnerable and honest about our practice and how we make ethical decisions as photographers. So instead of approaching ethics as codes or guidelines, I really like to advocate for a principles-based approach to ethics. So this, I think, is a really useful alternative that we can begin to sort of use and work with. I think that a principles-based approach can give us really useful tools. So we can use these principles as tools to navigate decisions, to help guide how we make decisions. But it's not rigid, right? It allows us that adaptability, that fluidity to use our judgment, to take into consideration the cultural context that we're working in. So it's not rigid, I guess is the word. It's fluid. So for example, you might say that safety is a really important principle that guides your practice. But you might need to take different measures to stay safe in different situations, right? You might not always take the same measures depending on where you are in the world, what type of project you're working on. So that's, I guess, an example of that sort of flexibility that I think principles can provide us. I think that the idea of approaching ethics as principles can also help to move the conversation away from that binary of that's ethical or that's unethical. I think instead we can sort of have a more expansive language to have these conversations. So we can talk about specific principles and how that principle has been applied. So we could say, maybe David and I agree that safety is really important in our work. But we can also understand that maybe David's taken a different approach to safety than I've taken, because maybe safety means a little bit something different to different people, or maybe it's just applied differently in different contexts on different projects. So I think that if we sort of tune into that idea of principles and we try to highlight the principles basis of ethics, I think that can be a really useful way of having these conversations and sort of moving away from maybe a more polarizing conversation that I think tends to play out and isn't usually very productive or helpful in sort of furthering really considered dialogue. So if we go back to that definition, so if we say, right, okay, this definition, ethics are the principles that guide a person's behavior. Fine, we know what ethics are now, right? But why do they matter, right? Why are you all here? Why should we care? And I think that this has a lot to do with what a photograph actually is. So there's a fundamental difference, right, between a drawing and a photograph. When we see a photograph, we have some sort of understanding that the thing pictured was there at some point. And this has a lot to do with our own senses, how we perceive the world, right? Because a photograph looks very similar to how we perceive the world through our eyes out every day, right? So you already have that sort of level of similarity between how we perceive the world through our eyes and then the photographic image. But there's also a difference in how how photographs are produced, which is fundamentally different from how a drawing or a painting is produced. And this has to do with the sort of the history of photography, right? The analog camera. Now, I'm sure I'm not telling anybody anything you don't know here, but I think it's really worth revisiting how a photograph is made in an analog camera, because it impacts how we think about photography in really subconscious ways. So in original analog camera, there is a physical reaction between light that bounces off the person, place, or thing. The light travels through the lens and hits the photosensitive surface, right? Hits the film at the back of the camera. And that's a physical relationship that sort of ties reality to the image in a really special way, in a way that's very different from drawings and photographs, which are sort of mediated through the artist's hand, right? Susan Sontag described this as a trace, something stenciled off the reel like a footprint. And there are a lot of theories. I'm not going to get too much into the theories, but there are a lot of theories of photographic trace and photographic indexicality. And these theories are used to describe this relationship, this special relationship that the photograph has with the real out in the world, right? And these theories are based on the analog camera. And importantly, these early camera technologies also coincided with the rise of positivism, which is the theory that truth is directly observable, right? So photographic technologies, which had this sort of physical connection between the image and real life, combined with this positivist theory that truth is observable, and resulted in a really privileged relationship with the idea of truth, so much so that the camera was entrusted to actually be a scientific tool for observation. So the sort of connection between reality and the image combined with positivism led to this use of photography for scientific observation. And of course, because we used photography for scientific observation, that further cemented our trust in images, right? Because scientists are using this, right, to portray the world in a ostensibly objective, we can get into that, an ostensibly objective way, right? And so this whole relationship with reality and the image has been very wrapped up over a couple centuries, right? Or since the invention of photography, I guess. I'm not so good with numbers, so apologies. It's not really a couple centuries, but you know what I mean. So this relationship has meant that we trust images. And for this reason, photographs shape how we see the world, right? So when we're taking and sharing images, we're playing a really active role in shaping how other people see the world. I like to think about it almost as like data points in our mind, right? Every time we see a photograph, it like adds another data point to what we know about a community or a topic or a person or whatever's represented in that photograph, right? So it's a very significant power that we have as image makers, right? And this sort of culmination of these data points in our mind have real life impacts. So I have co-written an article with Andrew Jackson for Trigger called The Impact of the White Male Gaze. And in that article, we quoted Lee Donaldson, who wrote about a study, and the study was called Media Representations and Impact on the Lives of Black Men and Boys. And Lee Donaldson wrote that, quote, negative mass media portrayals were strongly linked with lower life expectations among Black men. These portrayals, constantly reinforced in print media, on television, the internet, fiction shows, print advertising, and video games, shape public views of and attitudes toward men of color. They not only help create barriers to advancement within our society, but also make these positions seem natural and inevitable. So it's not just photojournalism and documentary work that shapes our perceptions, right? So first of all, this has real life impacts, right? And I think that really comes through in this quote. But it isn't, I think a lot of times we think that photojournalism and documentary work are really the things that shape our view of the world, but it's actually all types of photography. It's in art and advertising and social media. So all photography impacts how we shape or how we see the world, and how we see ourselves. So I'd like to just reference as well the 2018 study titled "Picture Perfect: The Direct Effect of Manipulated Instagram Photos on Body Image in Adolescent Girls." And in this study, the researchers showed that exposure to manipulated Instagram photos directly led to a lower body image. Now, I don't think that's going to surprise anybody, right? But what is a little bit surprising, I mean, it's not overly surprising, but it's really useful to have the data on it, right? But what I think did surprise me when I was reading the study was that one of the findings was that the authors actually were questioning the ability of the adolescent girls in the study, their ability to detect manipulation. And I thought that that was really interesting, that a lot of times they were looking at images and they couldn't tell if they had been manipulated or not. Because I think, we all know that images can be manipulated. And so, when we're talking about these ideas of truth and photography, like I'm sure every one of you is thinking, well, what about manipulation? I think it's a really valid question. We all know that that happens, right? We know that the photographs that we're looking at might not be telling the truth. But I think there's something really interesting embedded within the question, which is that the starting assumption is that the photograph is accurate, has a relationship with reality, but it has been manipulated. So it sort of goes back to that starting assumption of some degree of trust that we have with an image. Now, this is again further complicated by AI. And now we know that there are plenty of images that have absolutely no relationship to reality that are, well, I mean, I guess you could say they do have a relationship to reality because they're learning from somewhere. But there are images that are completely AI generated now. And there are really big ethical discussions that are happening about sort of the circulation of photorealistic images that are AI produced. And again, I think the really interesting thing about those conversations and those discussions that are happening is that there's a fear of how AI generated sort of photorealistic images can have a direct impact on politics and how we remember history. And I think, again, this fear points to that sort of trust that we have with things that look photographic, things that look like this, similar to how we perceive the world through our eyes. And it's sort of that heightened level of, I think, ethical responsibility that comes through when things are sort of photorealistic, because that photorealistic representation has a huge amount of power for shaping our perception and our understanding of the world around us. And I was recently told that I'm accidentally quoting Spider-Man, so I apologize, but with the power comes responsibility, right? And it's a trope, but it's a trope for a reason. So to meet this responsibility, something that we have launched at the Photography Ethics Center and something that we're asking all photographers to do is to write their own statement of ethics. So a statement of ethics is really a declaration of the ethical principles which guide your own work and a description of how you enact them in practice. So it's an action-oriented statement, right? It's not just sort of empty words like I believe in dignity, right? It's like, what does dignity look like? How do you work toward dignity in your images? And really the purpose of this idea of the Statement of Ethics campaign is to try to explore what ethics means for yourself and to share that commitment to ethics with others, with the aim of encouraging transparency and fostering accountability across the industry. I think it can be a really great signpost to others as well that, if colleagues see your website and they see a statement of ethics on your website, I think it's a good signpost to people that this is important. This is worthy of our time and consideration. I've taken the time to think about it and to write it down and to post it and share it. So I think that this is one way, not the only way, but one of the many ways that we can try to work together collectively to embed a culture of ethics in the industry. So if you're interested in that, please have a look at the link, and you can make the pledge and sort of commit to writing your own statement of ethics. So that is, in 27 minutes, that's a brief introduction to what are photography ethics and why do they matter. So thank you very much for everyone's attention, and I'm really happy to take any questions that you might have.
That's great, Savannah. Thank you. Yes, we've got a couple of questions for you. Again, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box. That's where I'll be looking for the questions. Question from Stefan about this idea of codes and rules and so on. And they say, how about focusing on a general rule, which, for example, could be, quote, do no harm, which obviously is a concept that has quite a lot of power, quite a lot of history coming out of the humanitarian sector itself, out of medicine, and so on. Do you see something like that being an applicable rule, or do you think about it as a general principle, or do you think there are some problems with a general statement like do no harm?
I think that that's a great starting point for sure. I mean, I think, you know, the principles can really be whatever you want them to be. And I would very much encourage people to come up with your own and not sort of copy, you know, a set of principles from somebody else that looks good, because I think that it's not only about identifying what the principles are, but how do you actually enact them? So sure, yeah, do no harm is a really great starting point, a really great principle to consider. But what does that actually look like in practice? And how do you do no harm, right? How do you sort of take those steps and put that into action? I think that if we don't identify actions, I think that there's a real risk of it becoming sort of empty platitudes where we sort of say, you know, this is what we believe, but it also, not only is it, can it be a bit empty, but it's really hard to put into practice if we don't know how we're going to put it into practice. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yep. Question from someone who's listed as anonymous. It's about your views on the ethical issues, ethical considerations of press photography awards, particularly involving conflict. They cite a conversation with someone at 20 odd years ago at a World Press Photo Awards event where they say a reputable photographer told a story about knowing other photographers who gave a local person half a $50 bill to go into dangerous zones and get pictures. If they came back alive, they got the other 50. The question is, how does an industry balance the complexity of this? I think I'd like to make a first answer on that is, I don't think there's much very complex about that example if it was true. I wouldn't have much hesitation personally in saying that that is completely unethical on a number of different grounds and would be disgraceful. And that if a contest ever knew about that, you know, that person would have broken every code principle and of being a decent human being, let alone entering a contest. But thinking about the general issue of press photography, conflict, and awards, are there particular considerations that apply? Or do you think that some of the general considerations that you've been talking about also are a way to start approaching this?
I think there are definitely specific, like particular considerations that are very complex. I would agree with you. You know, I rarely say that something is blanketly unethical, but that situation's blanketly unethical. But there are other, you know, situations that are, I mean, the very nature, I think, a lot of times of awards can be very sort of fraught with ethical complication. I think that sometimes it can create hotspots where photographers go for the image, right? Maybe, and they don't maybe have a very good local understanding or contextual knowledge of what's happening. But I've heard of, you know, places that sort of become the thing that you have to go and have one of those photos in your portfolio. I think that's really complicated and not very helpful maybe for creating maybe a more nuanced or dynamic representation of the world. I mean, also there are, of course, ethical considerations about sending yourself much less, the people that you work with, fixers or anybody else, translators, into situations of conflict. So I think there's a lot of sort of ethical consideration to think about how we think about our safety and the safety of the people that we're working with, which of course are amplified when you're going into situations that are conflict contexts.
Yeah. You finished out with some examples about AI and those Elliot Higgins images where he was, which were really interesting because he was playing with Mid-Journey and putting in political examples to prove the point that you could produce some extremely misleading images of events that you, in that case, might wish to happen, but haven't actually happened or haven't happened that way. Question from Michael. Do you think AI is sort of a particular thing that's destroying the link that you talked about in analog photography, that idea of the trace of the real? Is this a profoundly new development?
I think that this is something that I think a lot of people are still grappling with, right? And still trying to understand what are the implications of this. I think that the thing that is maybe worth saying is that I don't think AI, like anything, is all good or all bad. I think that there's definitely really interesting possibilities for AI. And I mean, it's a complicated question. It's a complicated question. I don't have a terribly satisfying answer for it right now. But I think that there is something different about AI produced images versus, the manipulation that we already know happens. But yeah, I think part of me wants to say that, time will tell a little bit. But I think that in a way as well, a lot of the issues are similar in terms of thinking about like ethics of representation, which is something that I talk about a lot. I think that the representational issues of, what we were talking about earlier, how the representation of people in photographs shapes the world. Like, I think that that's going to be equally true with AI. So I think that the representational issues are following AI.
Yeah. And I would just say to people who are interested in that, obviously it is on the one hand early days, yet things are happening at great pace. We had a discussion about AI with Fred Ritchen and Thomas Van Houtlieve back in July, and the video of that discussion is on our video page, and that was a really good first dive into some of these issues, and they both show that it carries on some of the same themes and problems with established questions of manipulation, but also introduces some new and extremely disturbing elements to it as well. So it has overlap, but it's also distinctive, as is the want of these things.
I'll have to check that out as well. It sounds interesting.
Indeed. Question from Arturo to you. How do you see photo ethics relating to wider contemporary debates on ethics? I mean, I think this is interesting given your background in anthropology, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all connected, right? So I guess when I started the Photography Ethics Center, I'll try to keep this very brief, but I was really coming at it from an anthropological perspective. So I think everything that I've been trying to do is really, in a way, trying to sort of package a lot of those concepts from anthropology about positionality, reflexivity, ethical engagement, cultural sensitivity, and make those useful for photographers, not only useful, but applicable for photographic practice. So I think that there's, it's very embedded in other debates, also other debates about representation that are happening. Oh, I had another point on that and it's just left me. It might come back to me. Sorry, Arturo. I will try to refine that before we end.
Yeah, no problem. Haley's got an interesting question. I would love to hear your thoughts on collaborating with partners and colleagues to either negotiate or create a joint ethical approach when you might individually have different assumptions or approaches, the application of ethics in different scenarios. How do you manage that sort of negotiation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's it can be very difficult, right? I think that one of the things maybe that could be quite useful to think about. Oh, I was going to look at your question, but I've lost it there. Oh, there it is. One of the things that could be quite useful to think about is to maybe like collaboratively, look at how has the thing that you're looking at been represented previously. And then you all can sort of have maybe a starting point for, what has that representation looked like and how can you sort of diverge from that. But as well, I would say that this, I think a principles-based approach could be a really effective way of handling that conversation or approaching that conversation, to maybe think with your partners or colleagues about, what principles do we want to guide this project, and how can we use those principles, or what do those mean to each of us, right? And try to sort of almost crowdsource ideas that can sort of underpin a project. And I definitely think it's useful to think about it as principles which underpin the project, and not something that's just overlaid, like these are the ethical rules that we're going to overlay on top of it. I think that not only will be harder to establish, but I think it isn't as rich. I think it can be a lot richer if you can sort of have those guiding principles from the sort of inception of the project. I hope that that's useful for you, Haley.
Question from Mark. How do you see the balance in ethics statements between aspirational values related to the purpose of the work versus red lines that won't be crossed?
I think it does both, actually. I think you can do both within your statement. I think impact is a huge ethical question, So I think if we're not thinking about sort of the purpose of the work and our aspiration for what that work does in the world, I think that that's something that could be missing if we're not sort of addressing that in a statement. But of course, I think the red lines, they won't be crossed, or your sort of ethical certs that you have for yourself about, like, this is the type of photography that I do. These are the things that I do ethically in every project. I think those are also have a very clear place in the statement of ethics. So I think it's both. I hope that answers your question, Mark.
And that's consistent with kind of your approach in terms of general principles that guide behavior, because there will be some things that are aspirational principles that you're trying to apply in different contexts, but then you will also have a number of red lines yourself, which may or may not match other people's red lines. And that's, I think, one of the powerful things of the way you're articulating ethics here beyond the binary is that you're calling on people for constant negotiation and constant reflection of their positions.
And that's where I think the ethical literacy, the whole theme of this workshop series really comes in. I didn't actually mention it in the talk, but I think that that's a really important point, that the ethical literacy is about that constant negotiation. It's about, engaging with that in a fluid and complex way. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Question from Patricio. What do you think about the relationship and importance of captions? Sometimes another person writes the caption on a news photo and the story changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely important to think about, the words that we're pairing. I think, it kind of goes into thinking about the context of presentation and reception of an image, right? Because like you said, like the words are going to influence how a person is interpreting the image that's being seen. So I think, maybe Shimendra Delay is going to be a better person to speak to that, because he has sort of experience as a photo editor and a photographer. But I would imagine that he would talk a lot about the importance of sort of good communication on editorial teams. So good communication to make sure that, the photographer's images aren't sort of being distorted by captions, and that, everybody understands what's happening in an image. I think that's the communication is key for that.
Yeah. A long comment from someone who's listed as anonymous about whether there's also a matter of picking your battles on some of these things and thinking about ethics as principles and their application and so on. Picking your battles in terms of priorities. For example, this person says, what if my client is damaging the environment, but I'm being commissioned for a project by them helps pay my bills? I mean, you're not going to be able to answer everyone's needs to negotiate some of these competing things, but how would you start thinking about that? How would you start approaching an issue like that?
I mean, I think like the anonymous commenter said sort of at the start there, that there are systemic issues, that massive systemic issues. And, freelancers are in incredibly tenuous, insecure situations. And I think that, again, it's going to be, red lines are going to be different for everyone. And I think it's not, it's complicated, and it's a decision that I think everybody has to make for themselves. But yeah, I mean, I think there are massive systemic issues, which are probably making it much more complicated and much more difficult for freelancers who maybe do have sort of certain ideals that you want to uphold in terms of who you want to work with and who you don't want to work with. Yeah, I don't know. I hope that answers your question. I mean, I think that a lot more needs to be done across the industry as well, in terms of thinking about the gig economy and support for freelancers. So yeah. I think it's an evolving issue that absolutely isn't really down to one individual, but at the same time, I think we all can contribute maybe to a groundswell of sort of shifting.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the end of our time, but we've got one question, one comment to finish with, from Gabrielle, in relationship to AI and whether or not photographers should use image generators in artificial intelligence, given that those image generators are models which are basically scraping images from around the web and so on, obviously without paying any heed to who produced those images, let alone paying license fees and so on. There are copyright issues and so on.
Definitely.
Any thoughts that you have on that huge area?
A huge area. I mean, I've got thoughts, but I mean, I would say I think the most important thing I think is transparency. So if a photographer is using AI to generate images, I think it's just really important to make it super clear, beyond a shadow of a doubt, so that people can't be confused or be misled intentionally or unintentionally about the origin of an image. So I think transparency is really the baseline that we need to be working toward. I think that there are, of course, a lot of ethical considerations, like you raised, Gabrielle, about where those images are coming from, what they're being, what those software is being trained on, and I think that's a really big question for the industry. And absolutely, like, there might be many photographers who decide that because of that, they may wish to boycott a lot of those AI imaging softwares, and that's totally a personal decision that I understand.
Yeah, I saw some authors debating this during the week. Some saying they didn't want their books uploaded to language models that were using texts for their database and so on, because of course they weren't being recognized for their original work. Versus others who said, well, I want those AI large language models to have more accurate information in them than what they're getting off the internet. So I'm happy for my book to be uploaded to those.
Interesting.
No easy answer to that. Again, we're right at the beginning of this, and yet it's also running very, very quickly. So these sorts of issues are going to have to be discussed and so on. Let's finish with Arturo's comment, because I think it's an interesting one, particularly for the photographers going on in the workshop to consider and debate, but we'll also pick up next week and the week after as well. He says, I like the openness of your approach, especially your skepticism of an over-reliance on codes and guidelines, but it feels relativistic. Surely ethics are also communal and not only personal or subjective, I guess he also means. Mm-hmm. Perhaps this is where a more philosophical approach feels like it's missing, one that relates to wider notions of ethics beyond photography.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there hasn't been much sort of consensus in the photography industry on what ethics is, and what that means. And I think you're completely right. It is missing. And I think maybe what I'm hoping is that by sort of encouraging people to put the sort of pen to paper and to have a think about that maybe it can be quite a useful way of moving the dial, pushing the dial in a direction toward maybe a consensus in the industry. I think that we would really benefit from that, a degree of consensus that we can all work from, because right now I think it is a bit destabilizing or decentralized.
Yeah. Savannah, that's great. Thanks for addressing all those questions. Thank you very much for the presentation that really gets this 3-week series off to a great start. And thank you to everyone in the audience who participated today. Really great to see you. We'll be back next week with Danielle and then Shaminder in the 3rd week. And for the photographers in the workshop, we'll be starting that meeting in a few minutes' time. So we'll see you there. But Savannah, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, bye.